Okay, good people. Welcome to our first session on the Gospel of Mark. And we'll be following along the lectionary readings, which for the first few weeks at least will be parables and sort of stories of what Jesus is doing. And today we're looking at Mark 4, and there's two parables in Mark 4. And we're going to start by what we think parables are. And I know it's got a comparison up there, but I thought that we might just canvass you briefly and say, what do you think a parable is?
Years ago, I heard that it was a heavenly story with an earthly meaning.
Okay, well, that's a nice succinct way of putting it, I guess.
I thought it was the other way around, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning.
It probably is, actually, because we're using normal things from everyday life, well, first century life, in the parables we're familiar with.
I suppose you could argue it the other way, though.
It's probably a bit of both in sometimes.
I think that's right, yeah.
Any other dibs? Sherry, you took your mic off.
Can I say what I really like about parables?
Yes, you can, Matt.
I'm leading a service this Sunday on Paul's letter to Corinthians, and it's full of binary oppositions, good and evil, this life, next life, body, Lord. And the good thing about parables is it just gets away from all that binary stuff.
That's a really good observation. Thanks for sharing that, Matt, because there's nothing really binary much about a parable. It often, it's a story, isn't it? Which may have different interpretations. Sometimes there will be an interpretation given with the parable. You'll read in a lot of New Testament scholarship that that's probably an addition by someone to the text who needed it explained. I'm going to say that's bollocks, and that Jesus is following the traditions and the pattern that we find in the Old Testament. So parables were things told by the writers of the Bible and by the rabbis. We know that from their Jewish literature that we have. And there's some very famous parables. There's Samuel's parable comparing David with a callous rich herdsman in 2 Samuel 2, and the prophet's parable comparing Israel with an unfruitful vineyard in Isaiah 5. And you can have a look for them. The Hebrew word for parable, if John wants to pop the slide up again.
Oh, sorry, yes.
You can see it written in Hebrew. It's mashel, and it means to be like, or a comparison. It's like what we would call a simile in English grammar. So they're told to make a point about something to help people understand something and draw them into the story and make them understand maybe not the obvious. If we take Nathan's parable, are we all familiar with Nathan's parable to David? It's when Nathan says to David, he tells him a long story about a rich man who stole the poor man's sheep. And David is outraged at the end and says that man will be punished. And Nathan says, you are the man because you took Bathsheba, who was the poor man's sheep was Bathsheba in the parable that Nathan told. So Nathan very cleverly draws David into the story. David expresses this sense of outrage, and then Nathan whomps him and says, you are the one who's done the wrong thing. And David is overcome by remorse when he understands his actions. So it's to make a point, to draw people into a story and to get them, find ways where they might more easily understand something. And as we've noted before, it often draws on things that you might be familiar with, well, first century things, like you're sowing seed or bushes or geography or something around you that you would be something that you would know about, that you can look at and say, yes, I can see how it's like that. So we find it in the rabbinic literature after this time, and Jesus seems to have liked parables a lot, and he does a lot of his teaching using this particular form, and they're following the patterns and customs of the rabbinic mashal. So we've got our first question for you today is, given this background for parables, why do you think Jesus uses this particular form of storytelling for his teachings? We know he uses other things as well, but he does do a lot of this storytelling using parables. So your question is to unpack that and think, well, why did he do that? Why not just tell a story? Why not just tell people to behave themselves? Well, how did you go with this question? Why did Jesus use parables?
Well, I think it's because it's an easy way to get, it illustrates a point, something people can relate to.
Yeah.
It's familiar.
Yep, familiar, and a way that people can relate to something and say, oh, yes, that's right. Yep, I think that's a pretty good explanation. Anyone else have any advances on that?
I think that pretty well summarises, even though Dorothy wasn't here, she must have been listening through the ether somehow and picking up our conversation. It was pretty well exactly that, the familiarity of the context. But like we did make the point that even so, there were times when Jesus spoke in parables which weren't understood.
Mm. Yes, and it notes that in some of what we call the difficult sayings of Jesus, it actually notes that Jesus says that they hear but they don't understand, lest they turn and be saved, which is something that's very jarring for us, I think, to think of Jesus saying, I'm deliberately talking in riddles so they won't understand it and be saved. But we find that in Mark's Gospel. I think we find it in Matthew, probably in Luke as well, though John might have something to say about that. Is that particular saying in Luke?
I'm not sure.
About telling parables so people won't understand.
Yes, it is in chapter 8.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean that's across all the synoptics.
Yes. So, it's a bit hard for us to get why did Jesus say that. Maybe it's a way of the early church taking Jesus' words and putting them in a sense to make sense of the fact not all Jews joined the movement, for example, because some of them didn't listen properly or didn't understand. So there's speculation about that, but we don't really know. Any other comments people want to make?
I have a question.
Yes.
Did people at the time address rabbis as teacher or just rabbi?
Rabbi is teacher.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So it's our
Yes.
English translation that's when people say address Jesus as teacher, it's just the English translation.
It's actually what's called a transliteration.
Oh, okay.
Transliteration is when you take the letters of Hebrew or Greek and you find the equivalent English letter and you write that down.
Okay.
So rabbi is that's what, or rabboni it sometimes is just the Greek word that's used for teacher.
No, the Hebrew word. Rabbi is Hebrew.
Word, sorry, for teacher.
Rabboni is Aramaic.
Yeah.
And the I on the end means my. So Rab or Reb is teacher. So Rabbi is my teacher. Rabboni is my teacher. Yeah.
Sometimes in modern, if you're looking at modern Jewish stuff, you'll see rabbis in the Middle Ages referred to as Rebbe, but it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's all it is. And there are other words from Greek that also mean teacher, and they are occasionally used. Matthew uses a couple of different words. I think Luke has a different word for teacher in one.
Didaskalos.
Yeah, passage.
Greek word.
But Matthew doesn't use rabbi, so he's got to find other Greek words to say teacher. And the only character in Matthew that uses the word rabbi is Judas. So I'll leave it to you to work out what Matthew thinks of the word rabbi.
How are you?
That question stemmed from my thought that by continuing to by using a rabbinic tradition, he's kind of setting himself up as a rabbi and encouraging the listeners to see him as a rabbi, as a teacher.
Possibly. Depends on what gospel you're using, you're looking at. In Matthew, as I said, he doesn't use that term. He uses other terms.
Looking at Mark.
Looking at Mark, I just think in some ways it's a form of respect, and Jesus' disciples see him as their leader and their teacher. And there's not a rabbi school you go to and get a formal qualification. Not back in the first century, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that we've got a bit of an anachronism that happens because the word rabbi today is like the word reverend. It's a title of a person who holds a particular office and carries out a particular function in the religious community. And that that evolved over time. For both of those titles, it evolved over time. So presumably people that are called that were originally called reverend were kind of revered, something that's been lost these days, but they were revered.
Revered no one reveres you,
their people. And those who were called rabbis were called rabbi. The title stuck because of the function they were performing, they were teaching.
Teachers.
So Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots are the groups of Judaism that are named in the New Testament, and Pharisees continue on. And what the Pharisees and the Sadducees both were teachers, but the Sadducees, of course, lost their job when the temple was destroyed in 70. So that opened up the opportunity for the Pharisees, who had been teaching in the synagogues in all the villages, to continue. And it was after that, after the dispersion from Jerusalem, that rabbinic schools began to form and that you had settled, because I think the thought is that at the time of Jesus, certainly before the time of Jesus, rabbis were what we call bivocational. They were teaching, but they were also working in an employment to provide food and sustenance for them.
I mean, Paul raises that.
So there's a gradual consolidation and organizational development that happens. And so when Jesus is talking with the scribes and the Pharisees, and when he's using their what have I done? And when he's using their methods, he's functioning as one of them. He's functioning as one of the many teachers that were around, just as he functions, we'll see in later weeks, like one of the healers that was around.
Yeah. So it's more a title of respect, I think, at this point in time than Jesus setting himself up as the principal of an institution that teaches.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Mm. Okay.
Well, we've got two parables in the reading this week, so we're going to look at each of them in turn. The parable of the seed growing in secret, or the seed that grows and the person that planted it knows not how, and the parable of the mustard seed. So Elizabeth has referred to some of the parables in Hebrew scripture, and we know some of the parables like the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan. They're quite developed. They tell quite a story, and there's various characters in the story, and people are doing various things, all leading to a particular punchline. These two parables are at the other end of the range or the spectrum of parables, if you like. They're short, sharp, succinct, straight to the point. So the first parable moves quickly to the key point, which seems to be that after having planted and the seed grown, etc., the farmer goes in with the sickle, for the harvest has come. And we know that this image of harvesting with the sickle was, it was obviously an agricultural description for the people of Israel, but it came to be used by the prophets as a symbol of what God was going to be doing at judgment. So we have to think that even though this is a straightforward parable, it looks like, gardening 101, plant the seed, water it, wait, see it produces fruit, harvest it. It looks quite simple, but the punchline sort of has this underlying prophetic, I think, resonance. And we know that Jesus did proclaim that God's kingdom had standards and that those that were to enter God's kingdom needed to act in certain ways. In other words, he had a view that God's kingdom was measured, or entry into God's kingdom was measured by God's judgment, or what Elizabeth and I started calling a few years ago the righteous justice of God. That commitment to justice, we know some of the prophetic phrases like in Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We know the one that's been popularized by the Micah movement today from Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? So there were judges in Israel whose job was to, judges in ancient Israel whose job was to determine justice for the people. Moses, there's a story of Moses appointing the elders to be judges over the people. And as this continues on, it's a role that's picked up by the prophets, and judges give way to kings, and the prophets become the voice that speaks the truth of judgment, calling out for righteousness and justice. Those two Hebrew words, which are in the resource, tzedakah and mishpat. I don't know, did you want to say anything about them, Elizabeth?
I do.
Yeah.
Tzedakah, if it's on its own, can mean righteous or justice. It's like dikaiosune in the Greek also means righteous or justice. And either is a perfectly acceptable translation, though for our thinking they're not the same. However, if tzedakah is paired with mishpat, it means righteousness, because mishpat also means justice. So when you get the saying from Micah, you have tzedakah and mishpat both together. But a lot of other parts of the prophets, it's just tzedakah, and it can mean both, which is why John refers to righteous justice.
Yeah. So the prophets declare that if righteous justice is not found, if people do not live in a righteous way, live in accordance with God's justice, then judgment will ensue. And that's how the image of the day of the Lord developed, because Amos poses the question, the rhetorical question, is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? And Isaiah declares that the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, all that is lifted up and high. And that's bringing them down low and raising those who have been previously humble. That word, of course, we recognize in Jesus in the New Testament, calling for God's righteous justice to mark our lives, warning about the wrath to come, saying that the end is still to come through all of the turmoil that will happen to his followers in the days of suffering. So all of that stuff in Mark 13 kind of fills out what is hinted at perhaps in this ending to the parable. When the grain is ripe, at once he, the farmer, goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come. So the angle on this parable that we're offering is that it is pointing towards that end time judgment, not in explicit words that I've been using, but through the imagery of the scene that the prophets had developed and that Jesus picks up on. And I think that leads us to a significant interpretive question for us today. How do we understand this eschatological worldview? Eschatological meaning looking to the end of time when judgment will occur. How do we understand that worldview today? Particularly, how does it relate to the way that you view Christianity in the world today? Given that this really steeps through the Gospel of Mark and is given such a highlight in chapter 13, how do you understand this worldview that Jesus shares in?
Oh, welcome back, everyone. How did you go with that particular question about end time judgments and this worldview and how it relates today to us?
Oh, that's an easy little question.
Oh, very easy. No black and white binaries here. Well, I suppose there could be, depending on your point of view.
We haven't got a crystal ball today.
No, we don't have a crystal ball today, and I don't think they had one back then either.
I've been thinking about how the world will end. I don't know that it will, I don't think it'll happen the way it's described in, I forget where it talks about Jesus coming down and rescuing the faithful and all that stuff. I don't think that's going to happen. And I suspect that humanity will be wiped out as a species long before the Earth is sucked into a black hole or becomes a desolate, wasted landscape or whatever happens.
Well, that's a very optimistic point of view there, Sherry.
But basically, I don't know.
Yeah. Bill?
Well, I was thinking how this story relates more directly to how we live, or how we're called to live, and called to live according to our purpose. So, the purpose of this particular parable is things are planted and they grow through their life cycle, and they come to the end of their life cycle. It's fulfilled its purpose. I think it's all we can do, isn't it? Like, we can only live according to our purpose. And
yeah, that's a very pragmatic but helpful way, I think, Bill, of interpreting this particular parable.
Well, I think it's all we can do. I mean, maybe that we can read into it these end-time elements, but for how it would be interpreted at the time, and I think how I like to interpret it is God's intent for humanity is surely to live according to the principles of righteous justice. And what more can we do?
Well, I think that's dead right. I think that is God's intent for humanity. I guess the harvest imagery is a well-known imagery, or would have been to first century people, of the harvest as God's judgment. It was often a metaphor that was used at this time. So people listening to it, in all probability, would have interpreted that way. However, having said that, they would have also got the idea that if you want to avoid this wrath to come, then you live the way you say. You live out a life of righteous justice, and that's what you do. You live according to your purpose to the best of your ability. So I think they're both there for a first century listener. Any other comments people want to make about that?
Only that there's the world, but there's also us, and we all live and die. Like all of us will end, or end our existence in the way that we know it. That, if anything, it's a useful reminder. I know Western culture, we seem to want to not talk about it or ignore it, but maybe actually talking about it and thinking about it, not all the time, but it's a good thing to reflect on it and think about, as Bill says, what our purpose is, and living out the best lives that we can in the time that we have here on earth.
Yeah.
Because when you
I
go,
like the way I heard someone say, maybe St. Francis of Assisi or somebody, it's okay. No one knows when we're going to die, so I could die tomorrow for whatever reason. That's a possibility, and it's actually quite real for me. But at the same time, he said to plant a tree anyway. This is what you do. You live the best life, and you go with it. And okay, it could end tomorrow. It could end today.
Yeah. And I think Sherry's got a point too. If we don't change our ways with climate change, we'll be signing our own death warrant by the end of the century.
Yeah.
That's right. Enid, you wanted to say something?
Oh, it's all right. It's gone again, Elizabeth.
Never mind.
No, I think it was just on the fact that I was just saying in our group that there was a program on the other day on the black holes, and that there's a lot of black holes, and ultimately the Earth will disappear into the universe. But I mean, that was just a thing. But no, that wasn't what I was going to say at that point, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, I think the Earth will, but I think that's millions of years off.
Yes, I do.
But I think we'll probably destroy ourselves long before the Earth disappears into the black hole of our sun.
Yeah, I do too.
If we don't change our ways.
Because we're getting warmer much faster than they anticipated.
No, that's right. That's exactly correct. Any other comments people want to make?
I was just thinking, we had a little discussion the other day with Enid and a couple of others, and the thought occurred to me then how all these matters we interpret anthropomorphologically.
Yes.
That it's all related, all this, the breadth of all creation and the scope of the universe, all that sort of stuff. And we're this tiny little speck of inconsequence. And so when it's destroyed, there's still all this other stuff existing. So how we then understand God and God's purpose in that broader context, I think, is something we just don't grasp. Like does God's will still it's still a relevance, or is it something that's only related to our speck of humanity at this point of time?
Yeah, they're good questions, Bill. I don't know there's easy answers to them.
There's no easy answer to that, no.
Yeah.
All we can do is live in our world.
Well, that's right. I remember protesting to some of the Jewish people in our Christian-Jewish dialogue. I was annoyed about, if you want to believe certain things about God, then why the world was such a mess. And they said, look, the way we deal with this is we just try and change our corner of it. We live the best lives we can and try and make a difference where we are, because you just can't tackle the whole. And I thought that was probably pretty good advice at the time. So, yeah.
I think there's lots of wisdom to be learnt from the Jewish tradition.
Yes, there is, I think. And their idea that each sort of story or pericope of, cluster of verses has up to 70 meanings, and that's why you discuss them, because you want to try and find the one closest to the meaning. But there's always lots of meanings, and that's why Jews have lots of discussions. It's not because they're very argumentative. It's because that they're trying to seek out the truth, and that may never come to the surface, but you might get close if you talk about it and you keep an open mind and you interpret things. Jews also don't have this idea that there's this chronology of history. It's about how stories from ancient times intersect with where you are now. And that's really important to them. And in Christianity, we're very post-Enlightenment. We like to think it's a recitation of some sort of historical facts, and the Bible isn't. It's never meant to be that. And we could take a leaf out of the Jewish book in that sense and just understand these are stories pointing towards truths. They're not meant to be set in concrete about someone. And they convey the same biases and the same cultural nuances as any story told. Yeah, they're not pure in inverted commas, which is why they use parables.
Yes.
They don't just say, this is it, this is the way it is. Yeah, so we might move on to our second parable.
Well, we're going to do something similar with the second parable, and that is think about how these words might have sounded to Jewish listeners listening to Rabbi Jesus, Teacher Jesus, telling a short story, not making a definitive declaration, but telling a story which begins with a small seed. That the claim I've often seen it written now that the mustard seed is in fact not the smallest seed at all, but never mind, that's a kind of poetic license that you get in stories. But from these...
I hit the wrong thing.
Sorry.
Sorry about
Someone's dropped out. And Dorothea. Yeah. All right. So from this really small seed, there grows a shrub which has branches with birds nesting in it. So it could be a symbol of, from small things, great things grow. To this small origin, God's expansive kingdom can result. And certainly in Mark's gospel and highly developed in Luke's gospel, the idea of the kingdom being a worldwide entity open to people of all nations is emphasized. So Jesus in Mark's gospel offers hope to people who follow in his way, who engage in the righteous justice that God desires. And the parable of the mustard seed may well be evoking one of the Old Testament parables, and that is what we find in chapter 31 of Ezekiel, which talks about a really large cedar tree in Lebanon that grew tall, which towered high above all the trees of the field. Its boughs grew large and its branches long from abundant water in its shoots. All the birds of the air, I should have this up on the screen, shouldn't I? All the birds of the air made their nests in its boughs, under its branches. All the animals of the field gave birth to their young, and in its shade all great nations lived. And that last phrase kind of tricks you from this word painting image of this massive tree to what the point is, that Ezekiel is foreseeing all the nations being gathered under Torah. So maybe Jesus is telling this parable about the mustard seed to provide an evocative kind of image of the worldwide spread of the kingdom. Certainly Luke would imagine that's what he's doing, given the way Luke tells the story of the Jesus movement that follows. We know that the church has spread over time. The church has spread to all continents, to all nations of the world, and has reached positions of power in lots of places. And yet we know today in our part of the world and in a number of other parts, not everywhere around the world, but in various parts of the world, the church is not this thriving, all-encompassing, all-inclusive, powerful entity that the parable seems to be talking about. So the question we thought to consider was, how do you reconcile what we see happening to the church today with the parable's portrayal of the kingdom? And that's about the gaining of power and the lack of power, the widespread and then the diminishing influence of the church, but also the question has this interesting contrast, perhaps if you'll see it, between the church and the kingdom. So how do you reconcile what we see happening to the church today with what Jesus' parable was portraying the kingdom would be? So we'll send you off again for that.
Another nice, easy question for you to think about. And of course, does power actually equate with the spread of the kingdom? Because the Vatican and the Catholic Church has the Vatican and people are culturally Catholic in some countries, does that mean it's right and everyone else is wrong? So there's plenty of you to unpack in this particular question. So I'll open your rooms now. Hello. How did you get on with this easy question?
Well, I might kick off by saying Sherry said something, summarised my comments really well, which is quality, not quantity. I really like that, that you can be small and mighty. And just to add to that, I think it's neither here nor there about the church. The church is important to me and it's important to others, and I respect that, but it's about leading good lives of righteousness, justice, and trying to live out in our own lives good things and trying to do good things around us and forming alliances of people with different faiths. And in terms of the church as an institution, I don't really care so much about that.
Well, thanks, Matt, for that expansive view. And it probably fits what the parable's talking about. It's certainly one very valid interpretation of it. Anyone else got any comments?
Well, I think we agree that the church as it exists globally does not necessarily represent, we can't equate the church with the kingdom of God. But there are parts of it, I suppose, that are, and all we can do is plant our mustard seed in our community and, you know, water it and nourish it for all it's worth.
Yeah. Well, I don't hear any, you know, growls of disagreement coming from the group.
Now we want many plumed feathers of many varieties, lots and lots of different birds. That's what we're after in a nice, big, expansive tree. So,
yes.
Yeah, not a monolithic, huge institutional apparatus. I'm sure that's not. Well, I wouldn't want that anyway.
So the institution is not necessarily the kingdom. I'm understanding you all correctly.
Absolutely.
Yep, that was the general consensus.
Yeah. So what is the institution? What's its role in the kingdom then? Does this parable help us shed light on that?
I think we feel the need to organise ourselves and to have hierarchies and institutions and a way of, and it can work for the good, can't it? When you see parts of the church doing its good work. But then you see the church, I don't know, just somehow antithetical to the purpose of God.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I've seen a number of memes floating around since Donald Trump's indictments and convictions. And it's basically Jesus patting him on the shoulder saying, don't worry, they accused and crucified me as well. And I thought, Lord help us.
Yes.
If that's what your view is. So I don't think the church does always get it right. There's aspects of the church that probably aren't terribly palatable with the way people think in society. And I think things in Australia like the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse in Institutions showed the church at times just simply couldn't be trusted to actually do the right thing.
And that's caused a lot of mistrust in the community.
Yes, it has. It's become a real issue for how church sees itself now as the kingdom or part of the kingdom in the spreading of good news. It's a bit compromised in some ways, I think. But that doesn't mean every individual is, but as an institution, it's become compromised by these sorts of things.
I think,
Kevin.
Yeah, I think we do need the church and we do need the institutions. Just simply that we need to have a fellowship with each other. Also, the churches like Red Dove and our church do charitable things for the people that's less well off. If you're a person that didn't just read the Bible at home and do your own thing, you're isolated from the rest of the community.
Yeah.
By having the church, you're paying your dues, your stipend, you're paying your stuff like that. And I think the church is a very useful thing to have, regardless of what denomination it is. They seem to be focused on one thing, and that's the Christian way of living. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a really good point you make, Kevin. I do hear a lot of people say things like, I can be a good Christian at home. Well, probably you can't quite, according to the New Testament or even the Old Testament, because sharing your faith in community is a really, really important biblical principle that in many ways we've lost in our Western world, where individuality has become the centre of how we see things. We think about what's good for us or maybe our nuclear family, maybe not so much what's good for the community and how important it is to actually be in community and to share faith and to do things as a community, because the community's work will always be greater than the sum of its parts. So I think that's a really valid point that Kevin's actually making. If we were all just disparate people in different houses and not part of churches, we may not affect the same kind of good change and transformation that we seek to make in our communities in planting, as Bill said, our seeds to grow mustard trees and to gather people in and to help people. We're probably much stronger. That doesn't mean the institution doesn't lose its way at times. I rather think it can, but it does have an important role to play if the church is to be a power for good. And you're free to disagree with me on that, but I think Kevin's got a good point there, alongside what Matt and Bill has said as well.
I was thinking about how the early church didn't have an oversight or institution. I agree with what Kevin was saying about having numbers makes sorry, I just lost my window. Yeah, numbers, there's power in numbers in terms of fighting social justice causes and things. Yeah, but the early church was just a movement, not a cohesive institution with a oversight, which had its problems as well, of course. Yeah.
I think that's true, but it didn't mean it lacked leadership.
No.
If we look at the book of Acts, as unhistorical as I probably think Acts is, if you look at the book of Acts and the story it tells of the early community as it got together, they did get together. They did function as a community, and it's clear Peter and some of the other disciples were the leaders. James, the brother of Jesus, clearly led the Jerusalem church. So where they may not have had those structural things we think of as an institution, they certainly had leadership that guided them and helped them. So they weren't all flapping around, and they came together basically under the one roof. And I mean, that's the inspiration for much of the new monastic movement today, and was the inspiration for the old monastic movement of years gone by, you know, where people lived in community and they shared things and they worked as a community for the common good and the good of the community around them. It doesn't take long to institutionalise something. We know that by the end of the first century, the church was certainly institutionalising. We know that from the pastoral letters where it talks about bishops and presbyters and people who oversight stuff. And basically, the bigger something grows, the more it needs to organise itself into ways that people can understand and it can function efficiently, which is why when it gets sufficiently big enough, there's a tipping point and it'll move from a movement to an institution as it ends up recognising leaders and how you become leaders and how you're going to function as a member of that particular group of people. And that's just an organic thing that seems to happen.
I think the inverse is true too. We've seen the Uniting Church grew and grew, and yeah, we've got all this where it's kind of top heavy. There's lots of oversight people. Well, there's some oversight people, but there's the people that actually, the roles that need to be filled to actually do the work. Well, speaking of Loddon Mallee Presbytery,
Yes.
there's a real gap at the level kind of the presbytery level. There's just not enough people to do all the jobs that need to be done. And that's kind of true in a lot of churches as well.
Yeah.
There's a lack of
We're losing capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to downscale the institution parts.
perhaps. And I think that's what the Act 2 is about. Bill, you were going to say something.
Well, I was just thinking about like Christendom, and when that started, like with Constantine, and the growth of that movement, which I think Christendom is not necessarily the church, and it became like a quasi-political institution. I mean, I think in those Christendom times, you had what they called the kingdom of the sun, the kingdom of the moon. One was Rome, and Rome, like the Christian Rome, and the secular Rome. And so I think we've reached that point in society where that Christendom time is finishing, thankfully, and we can get on to being a more authentic church, grounded in how we're supposed to live and build a community or institutions which are trying to live out, the gospel or the kingdom that Jesus might have talked about. But I think we're stuck with this model of Christendom, which has permeated society and the world, and to me, it's crippled, what the church can be.
Yeah, I definitely think we're post-Christendom, and you can see that in the reaction when Christians, particularly if they're in politics, try and impose on people today their own views. It never works well. It just doesn't go down well at all, because no longer is the church and the state are not the same thing anymore, and they're not intertwined, certainly not in this. They are kind of in England, because the monarch is the head of the Church of England, but the monarch really isn't terribly political, so it's not quite Christendom, but it kind of is.
Although the US is becoming more of a theocracy as we go.
Even though they've got a constitution that specifically separates state and religion.
Sure.
Yes.
It's still quite bound up there. And you can see that in many states where people who've got these beliefs are really passing laws that are stopping other people who don't have those beliefs actually being able to live in certain ways. They're imposing on them their idea of what Christianity is, which may or may not be accurate, and saying this is the way it has to be.
And it's really dangerous in some places. Like,
yes,
there's this YouTuber I follow who had an ectopic pregnancy, and she, did it burst? I think a fallopian tube burst. And anyway, she was in, it was a medical emergency and had to have the tube removed and stuff. But if she was in one of the states like Texas, she wouldn't have had access to an abortion until it was a medical emergency.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in America, where white, pale, stale, old men who are even so-called evangelical Christians have imposed some outrageous rules.
Yes.
Yeah, apparently when they were debating that law in Texas, one of the white, stale males suggested the embryo should be taken out of the fallopian tube and implanted in the uterus.
Yeah, that's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems when you impose, and there's such narrow views of what Christianity is that's being imposed here, which is kind of, I think, part of the point Bill's making. It's not about some narrow thing that you oppose. It's meant to be about something that gives life.
And I think that's the point with, like Richard Dawkins has this very narrow view of what Christianity is. I think that's the problem with a lot of society. In general, a lot of people seem to think that all Christians believe the same straw man that Richard Dawkins talks about. And I think we almost need to say, forget all the things you've heard, all what you've come to think Christianity is and what Christians believe. Come and hear our story and make up your own mind.
I guess one of the best things we can do is be in relationship with people outside of our church.
Absolutely.
And live in a way and talk in a way and be in a way that isn't that authoritarian, oppressive kind of way of viewing the world.
Yeah.
Dawkins, wasn't it, to create a straw man and knock him down, and the straw man was a total misrepresentation of what Christianity is about.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. And while we've got people putting up memes from white evangelical Christianity in America saying, you know, Trump's like Jesus because he's now being accused falsely and crucified. I mean, we've got a problem, Houston.
I was a bit shocked to see there's such a thing as a God Bless the USA Bible, which includes the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Pledge of Allegiance. Donald Trump promotes it.
Man.
Yeah, Donald Trump did it, and he's selling it.
That's not,
No, that's not Christianity. That's politics. And I think the church has a place in politics. The church isn't politics, if that makes sense. I think that we need to protest unjust decisions that people making laws make. And where there's folk in our community slipping through our safety nets and living in poverty and not good circumstances, we need to protest that. But I don't think we should be sending out Bibles with our Constitution. Okay, well, thank you for the good discussion today. I think it's been quite broad-ranging and thoughtful. And John will tell you about next week.
Next week is a short passage from the end of chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel on Jesus stilling the storm. So we're going to be looking at that again in the context of some Old Testament passages and also doing a comparison about the way Mark tells the story with the way it's found in the other two synoptic Gospels. We thought we'd do that kind of reverse comparison next week. So that's what's coming up for next week, the end of chapter 4.